Today's reading comes from John chapter 1, verses 43 through 51. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathaniel and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathaniel said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning. We got some work to do on this passage. This is hard. Of course, it's the famous passage, can anything good come from Nazareth? And we know that question if you've been a Christian for a while, or if you've ever read the Gospel of John, or maybe if you've ever been around in Christmas time and someone quotes that verse. It's talking about the lowliness of Jesus. And we're focusing here in the Gospel of John over these several months, and we're looking at this small little section of the Gospel of John, the first 4 chapters of knowing Jesus. How do we know him? Jesus' disciples here are growing in number, and the last few weeks, last week we looked at John the Baptist's 2 disciples begin to follow Jesus, and Jesus asked that question. If you were here last week, he asks, what are you seeking? What are you wanting? And that's the question that sort of got pulled to the surface last week of what are you seeking when you're seeking Jesus? And that's an important question, and it doesn't get sort of put aside for this week. It sort of lingers in the background. What are you seeking? What are you expecting when you're seeking Jesus? As a pastor, I do a lot of weddings. And then with weddings, I usually do just some premarital counseling. We're doing some expectations, doing some preparations for what does it mean to have a life together, to nurture love and devotion and commitments towards one another over the years. And then you get married, and it's wonderful. And it's sort of, even the marriage ceremony itself, America, we sort of create unrealistic expectations for marriage based on the ceremony. You basically have a prince and princess, right? You're dressing them up, and people from all over the kingdom are visiting them for their wedding, and then they go on a vacation that's so expensive. And you get back to be able to have a second one, at least for another 15 or 20 years. And then you get back, and a year comes by, and you're married to this person. And right here's the difficulty. That person that you married was a fantasy. And that fantasy became a real boy or a real girl. And the problem is you got to stay married to the real person. The fantasy's never coming back. And so, you go back to the pastor, you kind of complain about the person you married, or the therapist or the counselor, and what needs to happen then is everything's disoriented. You need a reorientation about what marriage really is. You brought certain expectations on a person that they have no business carrying for you. It's crushing, it's burdensome. This isn't a sermon on marriage. But here you have Nathaniel encountering Jesus. And you have a real, sincere response of faith to Jesus from Nathaniel. But what Jesus exposes is all kinds of expectations that he's bringing on Jesus. And he's exposing them as inappropriate expectations. Now, it's interesting. For marriage, we often say, hey, your expectations were too high. You need to lower them. You didn't marry God. You didn't marry Jesus. You married Rick. And Rick's Rick, you know? If your name is Rick, I'm sure you're great. But the expectations need to be lowered. Here what's interesting is Jesus sort of, hey, your expectations are unrealistic, Nathan. Or not unrealistic, they're inappropriate. They actually need to be much greater. What are you bringing to your life with Jesus? What kind of expectations? But before Nathaniel ever meets Jesus, he has this question, and I wonder if you can be honest for a minute, it might be close to your questions about Jesus. It's the Nazareth problem, right? This passage sort of very different from last week's passage. It begins in a hurry. Jesus seemed to not be in a hurry last week, right? The disciples are following Jesus, and Jesus is like, what do you want? And they're like, where are you going? And he sort of, come and see. And they just sort of linger together. The details of where they're going, what they talked about, it just sort of, they just like, hey, is this story going to go anywhere? And this passage, it's all about location. Jesus goes to Galilee. There it says in verse 43, he goes to Galilee. Galilee is not a town, it's a district. There's a number of towns in Galilee. One of them is the town of Nazareth, which Jesus is from. But it's like a blue-collar town. It's a working class town. So if you're thinking of like Galilee, Nazareth compared to Jerusalem, think of like Yonkers to Manhattan, right? It's sort of blue-collar, working-class, day laborers. And to be honest, it's often looked down upon. And Jesus is from this district, specifically in Nazareth. And in this district, Jesus finds Philip, who seems to already have some connections to Peter and Andrew here, it seems to say. And the story sort of moves right past Philip's conversion story. It seems to be straightforward, doesn't seem to be much mystery. And so we have found him. He goes to Nathaniel, and he says to him in verse 45, we have found him. Who have you found, Philip? We have found him who Moses and the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Big claims. Big claims. What does it mean? What does it mean to be written about in Moses? To be written about in the prophets. At the end of Moses' life in Deuteronomy 18, Moses says this, that there's a prophet who's coming, who's like me. What did Moses do? Moses delivered people out of slavery from Egypt. He's bringing them through the promised land. He has a spiritual authority. He has power. And then the prophets, what did the prophets say? The prophets you could say so much about what the prophets said about this coming Messiah, but the prophets looked forward to the one who would lead them out of exile. They are currently in a life in exile in Babylon and Assyria and in Persia and Rome. They're never fully free. And an individual's coming, said the prophets, who will have such power and influence and authority that he's going to bring freedom finally. And this person was the Messiah. And here's Philip coming to Nathaniel. We found him. Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph. He is the one. And so here comes Philip. He's bringing all this promise. He's bringing all this hype. And all Nathaniel can hear is Nazareth. What good can come out of Nazareth? It's pretty condescending, isn't it? And Nazareth is pretty obscure. It's not mentioned in any Old Testament texts. If you look at ancient maps, Nazareth doesn't really show up. It's Nowheresville. But Nathaniel knows Nazareth. Think about the town where you grew up. Where did you grow up? And you think about that town that you have nothing good to say about? That's where Jesus is from, right? What we learned about Nathaniel, though, was interesting. And later in chapter 21 of John, it says that Nathaniel's from Cana. Cana is it's in the same district of Galilee and just a few miles down from Nazareth. It's like Hoboken trashing on Secaucus, right? There's like maybe a crosstown rivalry. There's a neighborhood fight. And I wonder if just part of the problem is that Nathaniel maybe sees a little of too much of himself in what's being described. What can come from Nazareth? What can Nazareth offer me that I don't already have? Right? He wants change, as we'll see here in a minute. He wants change, and he doesn't see Jesus or anyone from Jesus' neighborhood able to bring what he wants. I don't need more Nazareth. So Philip tells Nathaniel, we found him, the one who Moses and the prophets wrote about, the deliverer, the one who's finally going to break the grip of Rome. And all Nathaniel can hear is the address, Nathaniel, son of a carpenter. There's an old medieval saying about Jesus. It's in Latin, Deus temper minor. God always comes smaller than we expect. God always comes smaller than we expect. When we read about Jesus, and you think about the life that he offers, the thing that, what a life looks like in following Jesus, it just may not be what you're wanting. You're thinking about the cost, you're thinking about what obedience looked like to Jesus, following him. And you hear the description. Sounds like Nazareth to me. What good can come from that? Or maybe you've been following Jesus for a long time, and it started off with some excitement, some seasons of interest and zeal, and a lot of good things might have happened. You found a really good community. You found some comfort. But now you're looking at your life, and it still looks like Nazareth. Frustration still present, still single. Life feels like it should be different, more full, more alive. And I feel sad more than I'd like to admit. I see others, and their life seems to be moving right along. And I'm not sure what I've been offered again when I've begun to follow Jesus. Sadness and difficulty feel more settled than anything else. You know, have you ever maybe just asked yourself, like, what did I get again when I started following Jesus? That's a little bit of what Nathaniel's feeling, just like, it's just that impressive. I don't know if that's the life I want. You seem really excited, Philip. I don't know what's so exciting. You all sang loud earlier, and I'm not sure I know what we're singing about. And then, so there's the Nazareth problem, but then there's, the fig tree solution here in this story. Philip has no response for Nathaniel's Nazareth problem. He doesn't defend Nazareth. He doesn't explain Jesus. He just says, come and see. It's like, you got some Nazareth problems, issues. I don't know how to speak to that. Just come and talk to Jesus about that. Come and see. And Nathaniel does. He goes, and there's this scene where Jesus sees Nathaniel from far away, and he identifies him personally before he even gets a personal introduction. He says about Nathaniel in verse 47, now listen, this is where the text is going to get a little difficult, so it might be helpful for you to have it in front of you. There, it's printed in your worship guide. It says in verse 47, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." That is a strange greeting. But if you're if you're an ancient Jewish person, you probably knew the reference that Jesus was using, sort of a cultural reference. Like a famous book, we sort of use turns of phrases from books or movies that kind of have a reference point for us. Jesus is doing that. And the reference that he's using is in Jacob, in the book of Genesis. So if you know who Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in the book of Genesis, Jacob is sort of known, his name actually means trickster, deceiver. And that fit his character. He was not honest always in his dealings. But in Genesis 32, there's this story of Jacob is wandering through the wilderness, and in the middle of the night, he starts wrestling with this person who ends up being God himself in sort of a form of a man. And he's wrestling with him, and he gets this angel, this figure, renames Jacob Israel, the one who wrestles with God. That's his name. So from deceiver to wrestler. In other words, Jesus looks at Nathaniel and he says, this guy is looking for what's real, and he doesn't settle. He's a wrestler. He doesn't settle. He's an Israelite who won't put up with small answers and easy solutions. He doesn't want to be naive. He wants real answers to real questions. New York is full of people like this, isn't it? Right? The worst thing you can be called in New York is naive, right? No, I take public transit. I see things. I know things. We read the right publications. We understand how things work. We are not interested in superficial explanations. We see through everything. Give us a real answer. Get right in. And Nathaniel responds, how do you know me? And you can almost picture Jesus getting close enough to Nathaniel and say to him in a really quiet voice, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Now, that's a really obscure thing to say again. Like Jesus so far has said very vague and confusing things. But again, to say, you're under a fig tree is sort of like a poetic or traditional way of saying you're sitting down and you're reading God's law. You're contemplating the book of Moses. You're reading the Bible. You're wrestling with God. You're looking for answers. And I saw you. It's Jesus' way of saying, I know you. I know what you're wanting. I know what you're looking for. One of the reasons why God always comes small. Remember, that's sort of the surprising thing. God always comes smaller than we think. One of the reasons why God always comes small as Nazareth, is that he can get down to the very bottom of our desires. Jesus is saying to Nathaniel, and he's saying to us, I know you. I know what you're looking for. Listen, we have billionaires and politicians who go to war and go to space thinking this is what people want, this is what people need. And they assume that they understand desire from above. They read crowds, they read appetites, they read trends, they read fears. But Jesus comes low enough and near enough and small enough to actually reach the heart. I saw you under the fig tree. I saw you weeping in your room. I saw you hiding your tears on the subway. I saw your anger in the office when that person said that and you just wanted to quit. I saw you. Jesus goes down as low as Nazareth and says to each one of us, I know you, and I know you want something real. For Nathaniel, this is what he encountered, and it provoked faith and belief. He encountered someone who seems to have God-like insight into his life, but with neighbor-like love. Someone who seems to have God-like insight into his life, but neighbor-like love. Jesus doesn't come with a spectacle. He doesn't come with great, kapow as a king or a politician or a billionaire. He comes with knowledge, intimacy, and truth. And some of you have felt that with Jesus, right? You might be able to say, I don't quite know how to fully make sense of everything about Jesus, but he just feels like something real. For once in my life, I have felt known, seen, and loved, not observed, analyzed, and appraised. He just felt real. He felt like he had a God-sized intelligence into my life with a neighbor-like love. And so Nathaniel responds with belief in the categories that he has. He says in verse 49, he says, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Nathaniel gives Jesus his best words. Son of God, King of Israel. And Jesus says, it's pretty good, but it's not enough for what's coming. There's more coming. Your expectations of me are just too small. So what's coming? Well, what's coming is the path of the Son of Man. What Jesus does here is something that he does pretty common things in the Gospels. When people express initial belief, he sort of is underwhelmed by it. It's not the finish line for Jesus. He says in verse 50, Stacy said to me earlier, the one who read, she read scripture, she said, is Jesus being kind of sarcastic here? And he is. In verse 50, he says, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, that's why you believe? And then he says, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Again, here's another hard passage. There's a whole universe that's packed into this one verse. But let me step back here and give a little bit of framework of what Jesus is doing and preparing for Nathaniel as he begins to walk with Jesus. Nathaniel here is expressing sincere faith. And Jesus takes this expression and says, okay, right now, this is sufficient for you. This will get you started, but your heart will need to expand in order to keep going in the way that I am going. When we walk with Jesus, generally speaking, there are different stages. We can name them different things, but generally speaking, it goes something like this: orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. The orientation, think if you know Nathaniel's story as a disciple in the Gospels, think about his life with Jesus. He's right now being reoriented into the life of Jesus. And there is real belief, real joy. Everything is new. Jesus is real, and I'm following him. And maybe that's your story. Maybe that's where you began. Maybe that's where you are right now. It's kind of an exciting time. Things feel new. Categories are being reshaped, and you're being oriented into the life of Jesus. I'm trying to rethink my whole life now. And it's exciting. And then Jesus gets arrested and tried and executed by the very empire that Nathaniel thought Jesus was going to overthrow. Because Nathaniel here calls him Son of God, King of Israel. That's not that's a political statement. He's quoting Psalm 2. The Son of David, the King of Israel, is the Son of God, King. He's the King. He's going to free us. Everything collapses here. What's going on? That's disorientation. The things I thought I was going to get with Jesus in this life, they're gone. Things are not working. It's disorienting. And then the resurrection happens with Nathaniel. He was given a vision of Jesus large enough to hold the whole story, even the worst parts. And that that reorientation back to Jesus, what it demands is a bigger Jesus. And that's the path that Jesus is telling Nathaniel about even before it happens. Okay, just want to let you know, you're going to need more. This is good, but it won't be sufficient. The first thing you see here that Jesus does in sort of rebuffing a little bit, he doesn't reject the title Son of God. He doesn't reject the title King of Israel. Jesus never uses the titles that people use that have a misunderstanding behind them. You're calling me Son of God. You're calling me a King of Israel. I don't think you know exactly what you're saying yet, so I'm not going to use those terms. I'm going to call myself the Son of Man. Nathaniel uses Psalm 2 language, King of Israel. It's political. It's all political for Nathaniel. Jesus is saying, you're not wrong, but at some point you need something bigger than a political Jesus. The Son of Man is Jesus' favorite title for himself. And what Jesus is doing here, he's basically saying, what brought you to me may not be what keeps you with me. In other words, what brought you to Jesus may not be what needs to keep you with Jesus. There needs to be a deeper vision. And this is what Jesus is doing when he's using his favorite title of himself, of Son of Man. It comes from the prophet Daniel in the Old Testament. Daniel, and he's a prophet of Israel. They're all in Babylon. They're in exile. They're being occupied and then sent out as captives in Babylon. And Daniel gets this vision of a power, a strength, a figure that's bigger than politics can contain. In Daniel 7, he sees a figure coming on the clouds like a son of man, who's given dominion and glory and a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. This isn't just the King of Israel. This is something bigger than the whole world. And right now, Nathaniel is being oriented towards Jesus, and his orientation, his faith, is also attached with a lot of personal, cultural, and political expectations. And he thinks Jesus is going to threaten the reign of Rome. But Jesus is soon going to be executed by Rome. And then he's going to rise from the dead. Do you remember the first question they asked Jesus in Acts 1 when he's resurrected? Is now the time? Is now the time you're going to restore the nation of Israel, the kingdom? And Jesus kind of vaguely just says, bye, and just ascends. And it's as if there's just not a blip in the kingdom of Rome. It's disorienting, isn't it? It's a massive disorientation. Jesus is preparing Nathaniel for this. When disorientation comes, you will need a bigger vision of me. You need a bigger vision of life with me. You need something bigger than Rome. You need a kind of life, a kind of freedom. Listen, we're told a narrative of a kind of life, a kind of freedom, a kind of self-fulfillment in this world that will fail us. And when it does, we need a vision of Jesus that's bigger than the American dream. Like, do you have a vision of Jesus that can still be big, that isn't attached to just the promises of the American dream? You have something bigger than that. In other words, do you have a big enough Jesus for when the world breaks your heart? Because it will. And then Jesus gives this image of angels. Isn't this strange? Angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. And again, he's going back to the Old Testament. He's going back to this old story of Jacob. Remember Jacob, the deceiver, wrestler with God? It's another story that he's alluding to. He's on the run. Jacob seems to always be running away from people in Genesis. He's on the run. He's alone in the wilderness, and he has this dream. In this spot where he's at, this ladder appears. And on this ladder, on top of the ladder, the heavens are opened, and angels are descending and ascending up and down this ladder. God is in this place. And I didn't know it. And this is what Jesus is saying. That ladder that goes from heaven to earth, and angels are descending and ascending on it. That's me. I'm the ladder. I'm the opened heaven. The actual opening of heaven and earth is through me. In other words, Jesus is saying to Nathaniel, if you have me, you have something bigger than Rome. If you have me, you have something bigger than the American dream. If you have me, you have something bigger than what money can promise you. If you have me, you have something bigger than the marriage can promise you, that romance can promise you. If you have me, you have something bigger than the whole world. Now listen, do you see what Jesus is doing? He sees and accepts Nathaniel's belief. It's just that what brought Nathaniel to Jesus won't be able to keep him with Jesus. He will need something bigger. Jesus knows that disorientation is coming, and when it comes, he will need a bigger and more glorious Jesus than just a political Jesus, than an American dream Jesus. To get him through the pain and confusion and loneliness and even the suffering, he will need the kind of glory that Jesus points to here. He will need a heaven to open Jesus. He will need to help him. He will need something to help him live through the losses, to live above the losses. Listen, I know for many of us, we did a survey. Many of you filled out a survey, asked certain questions, and because many of you did, and I saw them, and I saw the answers to them, I know for many of us, we're living through kind of a disorienting time in our own lives. You've been following Jesus for years, and everything kind of still feels like Nazareth. Your job is disorienting, your relationships are confusing, singleness is frustrating, you're tired, and maybe there's a weariness that has set in and it just won't uproot. And maybe you're just sort of asking, I see a lot of people who are without Jesus, or I see people who are with Jesus, and people seem to be moving on and going up and up and up, and I'm just kind of like here. What did I sign up for again? Is Jesus going to come through? And here's the shift that Jesus is actually kind of calling us to. When that disorientation comes, and it just will. When it comes, what you will need is not that things that go back the way it was when your faith was exciting, or back to when it was easier, Or maybe what you don't need is your circumstances to change, that your supervisor gets a lot easier to handle, or an extra 10K of income, or something gets resolved in a relationship that's really difficult. What you will need, Jesus says, is to have such a grasp of his glory, heaven open, that I have something bigger than the American dream. I have something bigger than marriage. I have something bigger than and more transcendent than American presidents. I have something more precious than a pay bonus. I have something more powerful than anything in this life, because everything in this life can be taken away, and at some point it will. Samuel Shaw, he was a minister who ministered in a community in England during the plague. And he says, he's talking about this change here, this disorientation to reorientation change on created goodness versus learning how to feed on uncreated goodness. The difference between created goodness and uncreated goodness. Here's what I mean. Created goodness is our money, is our vocations, our health, our relationships, and these are all wonderful things. They're created goodness, but they're called created because they can fall apart, and they will. They do. But if our faith is attached to created goodness, then it is disorientating when those things fall apart. When our jobs are lost, when our relationships fail. When created goodness disappoints us, when things are attached, when our faith is attached, it just disorients our faith. And we don't quite know what to do with Jesus. We don't quite know what to do with ourselves. But uncreated goodness is the goodness of God's love, is the beauty of his majesty, the excellencies of his perfections, his forgiveness, his glory, his wonder. And these are permanent goods because you're attached to Jesus, and those become your goods. His glory becomes your glory. His beauty becomes your beauty. His inheritance becomes your inheritance. Remember when Jesus' friend Lazarus got sick and Jesus could have healed him? This is in the Gospel of John. We're going to look at it in a few months, but you'll forget this sermon by then. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of that story. Jesus delayed coming. He could have healed him, but Lazarus dies, and his sisters, Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, they fall on Jesus' feet when he comes, and they're kind of angry. They're happy to see him, and they're sad, and they complain a little bit. And it says, if you were here, you could have healed him. And you know what happens? Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. And the question that kind of remains is, why the delay, though? It was so disorienting. Why didn't you just come and just kind of keep all this from being so dramatic? It's because Jesus wanted to bring a resurrection, not a healing. And the reason why maybe Jesus waited, and maybe why Jesus is waiting for you, which is painful and disorienting, is because their expectations and our expectations are just for healing of created goods, but God wants to bring a resurrection and open your mouth wide and give you uncreated goodness that lasts you forever. Listen, be honest. Be like Nathaniel for a second, someone who doesn't want to mess around with cheap answers. Isn't it true that for us, this is me included, there are things attached to my faith, your faith, created goodness that if they were to fall apart, not work out, not follow through, you don't know what to think about Jesus. You don't know what to think about the Bible. You don't know what to think about the church. Why did I come into him in the first place? If this doesn't change in my life, is he real? Does he love me? Does he care? But don't you see what Jesus is doing here? He's foreseeing this happening in Nathaniel's life. He's foreseeing it happening in your life. This is what he's saying from the beginning. At some point, you will need to have such a sight and grasp of my glory and your shared glory with me, because everything else is fragile, everything else passes, everything else fails. But if you can walk through this disorientation, through reorientation, in other words, reorienting your life not on a fantasy Jesus, but a real Jesus who isn't someone coming to give you a great experience of more created goodness, of more American dream. But he's coming to give you something real. If you can move through that disorientation to orientation, reorientation, friends, there's such a sturdiness there. You learn to live above the losses. Because you get circumstantial healing, you got a resurrection. You get glory. Listen, that doesn't mean that Jesus isn't concerned about your longings. Bring your longings to Jesus. Bring your hopes of change. Bring your longings for breakthrough and your healings, and he may answer those prayers. He can. But he may just want to say to you, listen, you will see greater things than these, and it's coming. Learn to feed on uncreated goodness. All right, let's pray. Father, I ask for help. All of us, I even felt it this week, just sensing how much of finite things are attached to our faith in Jesus. And when those finite things behave like finite things and they fade and they fail, it's confusing. And the world breaks our heart. Thank you so much for being patient with us. You're not impatient with our sadness and our disorientation. You're a good Father who knows how to lead us and reorient us towards truth, towards a true experience of you. Pray for my sisters and brothers here in this room who feel disoriented and confused and maybe angry and sad. I pray you'd be just a good friend, a good Father who knows how to lead us through this season, who knows how to listen to our complaints and then bring some hope. As we come to the table, would you be present to us? Would you speak to us? We ask all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.